Margaret Eliza McCallister was 23 years old the morning her husband fell on the slope above Crab Orchard, and the hickory tree that took him was the same one he had marked in October to cut for their winter firewood. It was the 11th of November, 1898. The chain on the timber crew's drag sled snapped in the cold, whipped back along the slope, and caught Daniel McCallister across the small of the back. He lived 4 hours after they carried him down the rise on a litter cut from his own coat. He spoke twice, once to ask after the twins, John Robert and Thomas Alexander, who were 8 months old that week and asleep in the moss-padded cradle beside the cabin hearth. And once to tell Margaret to keep the cabin no matter what the deacon offered her. She said she would. He passed at 4:30 while she held his hand against the cold of the puncheon floor. They buried him 3 days later on the Crab Orchard slope, in the cleared ground above the creek bend where his father and mother were already buried under 2 flat stones. Margaret stood in the snow with the twins wrapped in a wool shawl bound across her chest, and the deacon Lemuel Pruitt said the words. When the words were done, the deacon offered to take the twins to his unmarried sister in Knoxville for the winter. Margaret said no. The deacon said the cabin would not hold a fire long enough to keep 2 infants alive when the cold came down off the plateau. Margaret said it would. The deacon said he would come back in a fortnight to ask again. She said he could come back as often as he liked, and the answer would be the same. He went down the slope with his hat in his hand and did not look back. That night, Margaret sat by the hearth in the 2-room cabin she and Daniel had built in the spring of '94, and she watched the fire eat through kindling that should have lasted 2 hours and watched it eat through it in 40 minutes. The cabin had been built for a man and a woman and a hearth fire fed by a man who could split 4 cords of hickory in a long October day. Daniel had split half a cord before the chain took him. Margaret had not the strength to split more than a quarter cord in a day, and she had 2 infants to feed. She would burn through what Daniel had cut by Christmas. She would burn through what she could cut by the end of January. And then it would be February on the Cumberland Plateau, and she had heard her father tell what February could be on the plateau when the cold pooled in the hollows. She sat by the fire, and she thought of her father. He was 61 that November, and he had come to the funeral and stayed 2 nights. Before he went, he had told her, the way he told her stories when she was a child, about his own grandfather in the slate country of North Wales. The grandfather had slept on a coal bench in the kitchen of a 1-room cottage above Blaenau Ffestiniog. The bench was made of flat slate slabs set in lime mortar over a hollow chamber, and the chamber connected to the kitchen hearth by a small flue, and a single firing at dusk warmed the bench through the slate, and the bench held its warmth until morning, and the grandfather and his wife and their 3 small children slept on the bench through the winters that came down off the Snowdon Range. And none of the children were lost to the cold. Margaret had listened and had said nothing, but she had remembered. And now, sitting alone by a hearth that ate her wood faster than she could cut it, she remembered again. Sandstone, she thought, not slate. There was no slate on the Cumberland Plateau. There was sandstone in the bed of Daddy's Creek, a quarter-mile west of the cabin. In flat parallel sheets, the rains had cut clean over 10,000 years. She had walked the creek with Daniel in the August of their wedding year, and she remembered putting her bare hand on a sandstone shelf at sundown and feeling the heat the slab had held from the noon sun. And she remembered Daniel saying the slabs there held heat better than the iron skillet on their stove. She had thought it a kind thing he said about the country. She had not known she would remember it. She put another stick on the fire. The twins stirred in the cradle, but did not wake. Outside, the wind off the plateau ran the length of the cabin and shook the window in its frame. Margaret McCallister, 3 days a widow at 23, sat by the failing fire and began, in her head, to measure. She walked to Daddy's Creek on the morning of the 23rd of November, 12 days after Daniel fell, with the twins lashed in a moss-padded crate roped to a hand-drawn sled. The crate was lined with carded wool from a fleece her mother had given her at her wedding and never used, and the twins slept through the half-mile walk. The sled was the small one Daniel had built for hauling kindling. It pulled easily on the frozen ruts of the wagon track. The sky was a high, thin blue, and there was no wind, and the temperature was, by her reckoning, 20 degrees above zero on the Fahrenheit scale. She left the crate with the twins on the rise above the creek bank, where the morning sun would reach them earliest, and she went down to the sandstone shelf with a coil of hemp rope. The rope was 20 feet long, and she had marked it the night before with charcoal at every 12 inches, so that she could measure without a wooden rule, which she did not own. She knelt at the edge of the shelf and put her bare hand on the stone. It was cold under her palm, but it was the kind of cold the body's heat could move into the stone, and the stone could hold, and she knew before she stood up that her father's grandfather's bench was not a Welsh thing only. She measured the bedding planes. The slabs cleaved naturally at intervals of 2.5 to 3 inches. The widest unbroken section was 4 feet across and ran 9 feet along the creek bed. From this section, with care, she could cut 17 slabs of the dimensions she needed. The dimensions she had worked out by lamplight over 4 nights at the cabin table. The bench top would be 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. That meant 8 top slabs, each 24 inches by 18 inches, set in 2 rows of 4. The top slabs would be 2.5 inches thick. The base would be 3 sandstone walls, 18 inches high, 3 inches thick, set on the cleared puncheon at the southwest corner of the cabin where the chimney rose. The base would form a hollow chamber under the top slabs. Through the chamber would run a single internal flue, 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall, in a serpentine path from the firebox at the chimney end to a small exit vent at the far end. The fire would draw hot gases through the flue. The flue would heat the sandstone, and the bench top would radiate heat into the cabin and into anyone lying on it for as many hours as the sandstone could hold the heat. From the specific heat capacity of sandstone, as she remembered it from a science paper she had read in the Rockwood Lending Library, she had calculated the bench should hold useful warmth for not less than 12 hours. She did not know it would hold for 14. She walked back to the cabin with the twins on the sled before noon. That afternoon she made a list. She needed a long, cold chisel. She had Daniel's, which was old and dull, and would not hold an edge through the work she meant to do. She needed a half bag of slaked lime for the mortar. She had creek bank clay and river sand, but lime she did not have, and lime was the binder that would hold the mortar through the freeze-thaw of February. She needed a flat farrier's hammer. She had Daniel's. She needed stovepipe for the firebox throat. She had 8 feet in the lean-to. She needed twine and tar for the flue joints. She had both. The chisel retemper and the lime were the 2 things she would have to walk to Rockwood for. She walked to Rockwood on the morning of the 25th of November with the twins on her chest in the wool shawl, 4 miles down the wagon track and across the bridge at the foot of the plateau. She carried Daniel's good Sunday boots, which would not fit anyone but a man of his exact size, and his pocket knife, which had been his father's and had a bone handle worn smooth by 20 years of use. She sold the boots at the Rockwood Mercantile to a logger from Crossville for $1.10. She sold the pocket knife to the storekeeper for 40 cents. With the $1.50, she bought a half bag of slaked lime for 35 cents, and she walked across the rutted street to the smithy of Jebediah Tankersley with the chisel. Jeb Tankersley was a Welsh-American smith of 54, born in Carmarthenshire and brought to Tennessee at 6, a friend of her father from the Methodist circuit. He took the chisel from her hand and turned it twice in his palm and asked what she meant to do. She told him. She told him about the bench. She told him about the 8 months of John Robert and Thomas Alexander and the 4 cords of hickory she did not have. She told him about the slate cottage above Blaenau Ffestiniog. Jeb did not interrupt. When she was done, he nodded once, and he said he would re-temper the chisel, and he would not charge her, because he had known Daniel since Daniel was a boy. He worked the chisel in the forge for an hour while she nursed the twins by the smithy fire, and when he handed it back, the edge was true. He walked her to the bridge at the foot of the plateau and watched her start up the wagon track with the twins on her chest. Then he went home and did not tell his wife or anyone what she meant to do, because a woman of 23 with 2 infants and a lost husband and a plan in her head did not need a town's pity. She needed only what she had asked for, and he had given her both. She began the quarrying on the 28th of November, and she finished it on the 3rd of December, which was 6 days. Each morning she rose at 4:30, fed the twins, banked the hearth to coals, settled the twins in the cradle with a wool blanket and the larger of the 2 cabin cats, and walked down to the creek with the chisel and the hammer in a flour sack over her shoulder. She returned to the cabin twice in the morning and twice in the afternoon to nurse the twins and to check the fire, and she finished each day at sundown, which fell at 4:30 in those weeks. The work of quarrying sandstone with a hand chisel is the work of reading. The stone tells the worker where it will cleave and where it will not, and the worker must listen with the chisel and not insist. Margaret listened. She set the chisel in the natural bedding plane, and she struck once with the hammer at 15 degrees off vertical, and she let the stone tell her whether to continue along that line or to move. Daniel had quarried sandstone for the foundation of their cabin in the spring of '94, and she had watched him, and she had asked him questions, and now in the cold of November she remembered the answers. She lost 2 slabs in the 6 days. She did not curse either loss. She set them aside and she went on. By the evening of the 3rd of December, she had 17 sandstone slabs of the dimensions she needed, stacked in 2 piles at the edge of the creek bed, 8 top slabs and 9 base slabs, and the chisel edge was still true. The hauling she began on the 4th of December, and it took her 7 days because she had only the 1 mule. The mule was Ned, 16 years old, the last animal she and Daniel still owned. Ned was steady on the wagon track and on the creek ice, but he was not strong enough to pull more than 2 slabs at a time on the timber sled, and the slabs averaged 180 pounds each. She used the creek itself for the first half-mile of haul, because the ice made a smoother sledge than the rutted wagon track. She walked beside Ned with one hand on his halter and one on the sled rope, and she sang to him in low Scotch-Irish ballads her mother had sung when she was small, because she had learned that Ned would walk farther for a sung verse than for a clucked tongue. On the morning of the 7th of December, the third day of hauling, she nearly lost a slab into the creek. The ice had thinned at a bend where a small spring fed in below the surface, and the right runner of the sled cut through, and the slab tipped. She let go of Ned's halter and put her shoulder against the slab and held it on the sled with the whole of her weight, while Ned, who had stopped at the cracking sound, stood absolutely still on the sound ice and did not pull and did not panic. She held the slab for what she later told her grandson was 3 minutes and what was probably more like 30 seconds. She got the slab back square. She walked Ned around the bend on the bank and back onto the ice past the spring and made the rest of the haul without speaking. That night, by lamplight, she carved Daniel's death date into the underside of the benchtop center slab with the corner of the chisel. She wrote Daniel McCallister, November 11th, 1898. She wrote in capitals because her hand was shaking, and capitals are easier than script to cut into stone by lamplight. By the evening of the 10th of December, all 17 slabs were stacked at the southwest corner of the cabin, ranged in the order she would set them, and she had cleared the puncheon in that corner and laid down a hearth of brick fragments salvaged from the old chimney repair Daniel had done in '96. The fragments would underlie the firebox throat and distribute heat into the floor instead of concentrating it on a single point. She had thought of this herself, sitting at the table with the twins asleep. She told Ned in the lean-to that night when she went out to give him his evening fodder. Ned ate the fodder and did not comment. Margaret McCallister was 23 years old, and she was building a thing her husband had not seen, and her father had only told the rumor of, and she had not in 23 years felt anything as complete as the certainty she felt that night under the lean-to roof with the mule eating beside her. She mixed the first batch of mortar on the morning of the 11th of December at the cabin table while the twins were nursing. The recipe was 1 part slaked lime, 2 parts river sand, 1 part creek bank clay, mixed with cold water to the consistency of thick porridge. She had worked it out from a builder's manual she had read at the Rockwood Lending Library 2 years before, and from her father's instructions for chinking mortar, and she had tested it on 3 sample blocks in the lean-to over 4 nights, firing each block in a small grate and observing how it cured. The third block, with the proportions 1 to 2 to 1, had cured to a hardness her thumbnail could not mark, and had survived a freeze-thaw cycle without cracking. She set the base course on the 12th of December. She laid the 9 base slabs in a U shape against the southwest corner of the cabin, with the open end of the U facing the chimney. The firebox would open into the chimney throat through a square hole cut into the chimney wall on the morning of the 11th, which was the only piece of work she had asked help for. She had asked Jeb Tankersley to walk up from Rockwood and cut the hole, because cutting a square hole into a sound chimney without cracking it is a smith's work and not a widow's. Jeb had walked up and cut the hole in 2 hours with his own chisels, and had refused supper and had walked home in the dark. The base course took her 3 days. She set each slab in a 1/2-inch bed of mortar, level by the eye, square to the chimney, and she let each course cure for 12 hours before the next was added. She built the U 18 inches high. The interior was the hollow chamber. Through the chamber she set the serpentine flue, made of flat sandstone shards left over from the quarrying, set on edge in 2 parallel rows to form a duct 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall. The duct ran from the firebox along the back wall, turned 90 degrees at the corner, ran along the side wall, turned 90 degrees again, and ended at an exit vent set into the front face of the bench at the far end. The vent was a 4-inch length of stovepipe set into the mortar and faced with a small iron damper she had cut from an old tin pail. The damper was rough, but it worked. The top slabs she set on the 17th of December. She laid them in 2 rows of 4 with 1/4-inch mortar joints. The top of the bench was 6 feet long by 3 feet wide and stood 18 inches above the puncheon. She tamped the joints with the back of a wooden spoon, and she scraped the excess mortar with the edge of a knife, and she let the whole bench cure for 3 days before the first fire. During the cure, she kept the cabin hearth low and constant, 24 hours a day, to draw warm air through the flue and set the mortar evenly. She fed it small splits of well-seasoned hickory and did not let the fire roar, and did not let it gutter. On the evening of the 20th of December, she lit the first fire in the firebox. She fed it pine kindling for 15 minutes, and then added 2 small splits of hickory, and let the fire run for 40 minutes, and then let it fall to coals. She watched the bench through the night by lamplight, and at midnight she set her bare hand on the center slab, and the slab was warm under her palm. The kind of warm a sun-warmed stone is at the end of a summer afternoon, and she stood at the bench in the dark with the twins asleep in the cradle, and she wept for the first time since the funeral. She wept without sound. She wept for Daniel and for her father's grandfather above Blaenau Ffestiniog, and for herself, who was 23, and had built a stone bench in a Tennessee winter that held the heat of a 40-minute fire for 6 hours and was already, on its first firing, doing what she had said it would do. She fired the bench again on the evening of the 23rd of December, and she let the fire run an hour, and she watched, and she measured. The benchtop center slab reached 84 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight, measured with the small mercury thermometer Daniel had bought her for tracking the milk fever in cattle they no longer owned. The slab held 73 degrees at sunrise. She fired the bench a 3rd time on Christmas Eve with a heavier load, and the slab reached 89 degrees by 10 o'clock, and at 6 in the morning of Christmas Day, 8 hours later, the slab was at 76 degrees. And Margaret McCallister, who had not slept on a soft surface since the night before Daniel fell, lay down with the twins on a wool-lined cradle pad on the bench top and slept 4 uninterrupted hours, the longest unbroken sleep she had had since the 2nd month of her pregnancy. She did not fire the bench again until the new year, wanting the cure to set fully. She kept the cabin warm with the hearth alone through the last week of December and the first week of January, and she watched the bench every day for cracks, and there were none. On the 2nd of January, 1899, she fired the bench at 4 in the afternoon for an hour and 40 minutes with the firebox damper open 3/4. By midnight, the slab was at 91 degrees. By 6 in the morning of the 3rd, 14 hours after the firing, the slab was at 74 degrees, and the cabin air, which had been 38 degrees at midnight, was at 46. The bench had given off enough radiant heat through the night to raise the cabin air by 8 degrees, and it had held its own surface above the comfort threshold for 14 hours. She wrote the numbers in the back of her father's old account book. She underlined the 14. The great Arctic outbreak began on the morning of the 9th of February, 1899. The temperature in Rockwood at sunrise was 4 degrees above zero on the Fahrenheit scale. By sunset, it was 8 below. By the morning of the 10th, it was 19 below. By the morning of the 11th, It was 31 below at the Rockwood store, and 35 below on the Cumberland Plateau where Margaret McCallister's cabin stood. The wind that came down off the plateau was 40 miles an hour from the northwest, and it ran the length of every hollow and every ridge from Crossville to Spring City, and it took the eaves off the Pruitt cabin 3 miles south of Margaret's at 4 in the morning of the 11th, and it tore the roof of the Tankersley smithy at the foot of the plateau on the afternoon of the 12th. It took 47 people in Tennessee in 8 days. It took cattle and counts no one had time to make. It froze the Mississippi River solid as far south as New Orleans for the first time in recorded history. Margaret McCallister fired the Sandstone bench at 4 o'clock on the 11th of February. She fired it again at 4 o'clock on the 12th, and on the 13th, and on the 14th. Each firing, she ran for 2 hours with a heavy load of hickory and the firebox damper full open. Each firing, the bench reached 96 degrees on the surface by midnight and held 71 degrees at sunrise. The cabin air during those 4 nights varied from 26 degrees Fahrenheit at the wall furthest from the bench to 48 at the wall nearest. The twins slept on the bench top in a wool-lined cradle pad with a heavy quilt over them and a goose feather pillow under each head, and Margaret slept beside them on a straw pallet pushed against the bench, with one hand always on the surface to feel for the moment the warmth would begin to drop, and the warmth held through every one of those nights. On the morning of the 15th of February, the wind dropped at sunrise and the temperature began to climb, and by noon it was 7 below zero, and the worst of the great Arctic outbreak was over. The Pruitt family had walked 4 miles south to Spring City on the morning of the 11th and had wintered with kin. Jeb Tankersley walked up the wagon track on the 18th of February to see if Margaret McCallister and the twins were alive. He stood in the cabin doorway, and he saw the bench at the southwest corner, and he saw the twins asleep on it under a quilt, and he saw Margaret feeding the bench fire with a small split of hickory, and he sat down at the table without taking off his coat, and he wept the way men weep who have walked 4 miles in 20 below cold, expecting to bury 2 infants and a young widow, and have found instead a warm cabin and a sleeping family and a stone bench that has done what it was built to do. He drank 1 cup of coffee, and he walked back down the wagon track to Rockwood, and he told the deacon, Lemuel Pruitt, and 3 others at the Mercantile that Margaret McCallister had built a stone hearth on the Welsh pattern that had carried her family through the outbreak, and the story went out across the plateau in the way a story goes when it is true. The deacon Lemuel Pruitt walked up to the cabin in March. He looked at the bench and took off his hat. He said he had been wrong in November. Margaret said he had not been wrong, only cautious, and caution was a kind of love in a deacon. Before he went, he asked her if she would teach the bench pattern to other widows on the plateau, of whom the outbreak had made several. Margaret said she would teach it to anyone who would listen. Within the month, the deacon had organized a circuit, and Margaret McCallister walked the Cumberland Plateau in the spring of '99 with the twins in the moss-padded crate on the sled, and she taught 7 widows and 3 married women and 1 old man to build the bench. 6 of those benches were built that summer. All 6 worked. The pattern spread through Cumberland County and into Roane and Morgan and Anderson counties, and it was known on the plateau as the McCallister bench for 40 years, until the names of the women who had built the benches passed out of common memory, and the benches themselves became the only memorial. Margaret McCallister did not remarry. She raised John Robert and Thomas Alexander on the 32 acres above Crab Orchard. She added a smokehouse in '03 and a small dairy in '07. She buried her father in '11, and she buried Ned the mule in '16 at the age of 34. John Robert fell in the Argonne Forest on the 2nd of November 1918, 6 days before the armistice. Thomas Alexander returned from the war and farmed the land beside her until her death. She passed on the 11th of January, 1952, at the age of 76, in the cabin she and Daniel had built in '94, in a bed pulled close beside the sandstone bench, with her grandson Daniel John McCallister, 9 years old, holding her hand. She had asked him the week before to write down the story of the bench, and he had written it in a school notebook in pencil while sitting on the bench top with his bare feet on the warm stone. He read it back to her on the morning of the 11th, and she said he had it right except for one thing, which was that she had not built the bench for herself. She had built it for the twins. He fixed the line. She closed her eyes. The bench beneath him was warm. It had been fired at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, and it was holding. The cabin still stands. The bench still stands inside it. The grandson lived to 91, and the bench was warm under his hand the morning he passed in 1993. The cabin is now a Cumberland County historic site, and the bench is the centerpiece. The interpretive sign tells the story in 3 short paragraphs and gives the dates and the dimensions and the weights, but it does not give the truth of the thing, which was that a 23-year-old widow with 2 infants on her hip and a half bag of lime and a re-tempered chisel and the memory of her father's grandfather above Blaenau Ffestiniog had walked down to a creek in November of '98 and had measured a sandstone shelf with a charcoal-marked rope, and had built, alone in a Tennessee winter, a stone bench that held the heat of a single firing for 14 hours and carried her children through the worst cold the continent had seen in a century. Her seal of stone holds. The bench remembers her. The cabin remembers her. The plateau remembers her. And the sandstone shelf at the bend of Daddy's Creek remembers her hands. And the heat of an evening fire set in a sandstone hollow in the southwest corner of a 2-room cabin on the high plateau holds through the night and into the morning, and the morning comes, and the children breathe, and the seal still holds.